25 missions was the number every 8th Air Force crew counted, and most never got there. On the 17th of May 1943, one Boeing B-17F would head to Lorient in France for the mission that completed that count. It was another daylight raid over defended territory, not a ceremony, and the crew still had to cross the same flak and fighter belt that had already broken so many others. The airplane was Memphis Belle, assigned to the 324th Bomb Squadron of the 91st Bomb Group in England. By the spring of 1943, Captain Robert K. Morgan and his crew were approaching the tour limit that dominated American bomber life in Europe: 25 combat missions. That number sounded clear on paper. In the air, it meant repeated operations over occupied Europe and Germany while 8th Air Force losses kept rising. Memphis Belle had already been at war since November 1942. The question hanging over Morgan and his crew was simple: what had let them reach 25? In early 1943, the United States Army Air Forces in Britain were still proving daylight precision bombing against German-held Europe. The 8th Air Force sent Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and consolidated B-24 Liberator formations from English bases toward targets in France, the Low Countries, and Germany. Their bombers faced radar warning, anti-aircraft artillery, and fighter interception. In that period, a combat tour for heavy bomber crews in the European theater was set at 25 missions. Memphis Belle was a Boeing B-17F-10BO, serial number 41-24485. The aircraft served with the 324th Bomb Squadron, 91st Bomb Group. Its pilot was Captain Robert K. Morgan. Its co-pilot was Captain James A. Verinis. A B-17F normally carried a crew of 10, mounted multiple Browning .50 caliber machine guns, had a wingspan of 103 feet 9 inches, and could reach roughly 300 miles per hour at altitude. Those specifications mattered because the bomber had to stay in formation for defense. By spring, Morgan's aircraft had already completed missions beginning on the 7th of November 1942. Each additional sortie increased experience, but it also increased exposure to failure, damage, and loss. The pressure around Memphis Belle built one mission at a time. The aircraft did not arrive in England for a single famous flight. It entered the 8th Air Force campaign on the 7th of November 1942 and kept returning to operations as the air offensive expanded. That timing mattered. In late 1942 and early 1943, American heavy bombers were still working out doctrine under combat conditions. Crews learned formation discipline, navigation, bomb runs, and emergency procedures while already under fire. For Morgan and his crew, survival depended on repetition and coordination. A B-17F was built around 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines. It carried its crew through long over-water legs, assembly over England, and daylight penetration into defended airspace. Defense depended on formation and overlapping gun positions, not speed alone. The standard crew of 10 had to function as a single system. Pilot and co-pilot held position. The navigator and bombardier managed route and target run. The engineer, radio operator, and gunners kept the aircraft fighting and reporting under attack. The enemy problem was also cumulative. German defenses did not need to destroy every bomber to break a tour. Heavy flak could damage controls, engines, oxygen systems, and fuel tanks before fighters even arrived. Fighter attacks could then finish aircraft already slowed or separated. Weather made both problems worse by disrupting rendezvous, visibility, and bombing accuracy. Every mission forced a crew to survive takeoff, climb, assembly, the channel crossing, the target area, and the return to England. That is why the number 25 mattered so much in 1943. It was not a symbol. It was an administrative finish line set against repeated exposure to combat loss. Memphis Belle became known because it approached that finish line while many other crews in the 8th Air Force did not. By May 1943, with Captain Robert K. Morgan still in command and the aircraft still operational, the record had narrowed to one remaining step. On the 17th of May 1943, the target for Memphis Belle's 25th mission was Lorient, France. With the target assigned, Captain Robert K. Morgan took Memphis Belle out on the same kind of operation that had defined the previous 24. The destination was Lorient, the major U-boat base on the Brittany coast. It was not a short ceremonial flight. It was another 8th Air Force daylight bombing mission in formation, with the aircraft required to assemble, cross the channel, hold station, and make a steady bomb run over a defended objective. By that date, the Belle had been flying combat for more than 6 months. The crew positions were fixed by routine and by necessity. Captain Robert K. Morgan flew in the left seat. Captain James A. Verinis was in the right seat. Captain Vincent B. Evans worked the nose as navigator. Technical Sergeant Charles B. Layden served as bombardier. Technical Sergeant Robert J. Hansen was flight engineer and top turret gunner. Staff Sergeant Harold P. Locke handled the radio. The defensive stations were filled by enlisted gunners, including Staff Sergeant Cecil H. Scott, Staff Sergeant Clarence E. Winchell, Sergeant John P. Quinlan, and Staff Sergeant Eugene Atkins. What they saw that day was what heavy bomber crews expected by spring 1943. The route to the target required time in the air before any bomb release. Formation spacing had to be held closely enough for mutual defense, but not so closely that one damaged aircraft would endanger the rest. German defenders at Lorient knew the base was a repeated target. The submarine pens there had already drawn earlier attacks because they were central to the Battle of the Atlantic. For the Americans, the mission objective was clear: reach the target in daylight, drop on the assigned aiming point, and bring the aircraft home. For the German side, the task was equally clear: force the bombers off course, break formations, and use anti-aircraft fire and fighters to reduce the attack before bomb impact. Memphis Belle completed the run to Lorient and dropped its bombs as part of the attacking force. Then Morgan turned the aircraft back toward England and brought it home, completing the 25th credited combat mission. That changed the crew's position immediately. They were no longer one more bomber crew still trying to reach the tour limit. They were a crew that had met it under the combat rules then in force. It unfolded that way because survival in a B-17F depended less on a single protective feature than on several systems working together. The aircraft itself helped. A Boeing B-17F used 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone radial engines and, in combat configuration, carried multiple Browning AN/M 2.50 caliber machine guns in nose, dorsal, ventral, waist, and tail positions. Its service ceiling was above 30,000 feet, but bombing missions were flown at altitudes where formation integrity and bomb delivery could still be maintained under oxygen. None of that made the bomber safe. It made it sustainable if the airplane stayed with its group. That point mattered because the 8th Air Force's daylight doctrine under Lieutenant General Ira C. Eaker relied on formation defense. A single B-17's guns had limits in arc and timing. A formation of B-17s created overlapping fields of fire. The closer the group held together, the harder it was for German fighters to attack one aircraft without entering the fire of others. The cost was that a bomber crew had to fly a predictable course on the bomb run, which gave anti-aircraft batteries a stable target. The men inside Memphis Belle had also accumulated something that no factory could provide. By the 25th mission, Morgan and his crew had experience with assembly, navigation, bomb run discipline, oxygen procedures, interphone coordination, and damage management. That experience did not remove risk. It reduced avoidable errors. German defenders understood the vulnerability of American bombers before and after the target. What they could not always achieve was the complete dislocation of a disciplined formation before release. At Lorient, as on earlier missions, the American side tried to trade maneuver for concentrated defensive fire and accurate timing. The real protection came from formation, crew coordination, and the B-17's ability to remain airborne after sustaining damage that would force lighter aircraft down. Once Memphis Belle landed back in England on the 17th of May 1943, the practical result was immediate. Captain Robert K. Morgan and his crew had completed the 25 missions then required for a heavy bomber combat tour in the European theater. In early 1943, that was a major threshold inside the 8th Air Force because the command was still losing bombers and trained crews on deep daylight operations. The aircraft's completion of 25 did not end the war around it. It did, however, change the status of the men who had flown it. Morgan and the crew were withdrawn from further combat operations and sent back to the United States for war bond appearances. That decision reflected more than publicity. A crew that had visibly completed the required tour was useful proof that the system could produce survivors, even while many units were still taking heavy losses. For the wider force, the mission also supplied a documented example of what 25 really represented. It was not one famous escape. It was a sequence beginning on the 7th of November 1942 and ending over Lorient on the 17th of May 1943. In that span, Memphis Belle had remained operational long enough to accumulate the full count under frontline conditions. The airplane's fame followed the completed record, not the other way around. On the German side, the destruction of the Lorient submarine base was not achieved by one bomber or one raid. The base remained a target because its U-boat pens were built to resist conventional bombing. That meant American crews could finish a mission, survive it, and still know the same target might have to be attacked again by others. So the immediate meaning of the 17th of May 1943 was precise. 1B-17F, serial 4124485, and its crew had crossed the original 8th Air Force survival line, and the details of how that happened began with the aircraft, the base at Bassingbourn, and the accumulated record of all 25 sorties. The mission list itself shows why the Belle's record mattered. Its first credited operation on the 7th of November 1942 was against Brest, another Atlantic port with major naval value. After that came Saint-Nazaire, Lille, Lorient, Rouen, and other targets in occupied France before the group was sent farther inland. Those early raids are often treated as easier than the later famous battles, but the record shows repeated exposure from the start. The 8th Air Force was still building formation discipline and target procedures while already flying combat. The aircraft's base also deserves more attention than it usually gets. RAF Bassingbourn in Cambridgeshire was not simply a backdrop for publicity photographs. It was one of the main stations from which the 91st Bomb Group launched into the European Air War. That meant long waits for weather decisions, early assembly over England, and repeated returns to the same hardstand and the same ground crews. The Belle's survival depended partly on maintenance crews who repaired battle damage between missions and kept 4 engines, hydraulics, guns, radios, oxygen gear, and bomb release systems serviceable on a punishing schedule. Its combat tour also crossed a distinct phase in the air offensive. Memphis Belle flew before the Schweinfurt and Regensburg disasters, but after the United States had already committed itself to deep daylight bombing. In that period, targets like Wilhelmshaven, the U-boat bases on the French coast, and industrial points in France and Belgium were not separate episodes. They were a running test of whether bomber formations could keep operating in daylight at all. Damage accumulation mattered even on missions that ended safely. A bomber could come home with flak holes, damaged plexiglass, punctured control surfaces, or gun malfunctions and still count as operational. That is one reason the Belle's record is misleading when reduced to a clean row of mission symbols. Each mark on the nose represented another complete cycle of takeoff, rendezvous, enemy coast, target run, and return in an aircraft that had already been stressed by previous combat. And there is one more overlooked point in the chronology. The Belle finished its tour in May 1943, before long-range escort fighters could routinely remain with the heavy bombers all the way to the deepest targets. That places its 25 not at the easier end of the bomber war, but inside one of its harshest learning periods. The 25 mission rule was itself a measure of how dangerous the campaign was expected to be. In the European theater, Heavy bomber crews were originally credited with completing a tour after 25 missions because loss rates in 1942 and early 1943 made that number an extreme test of survival. It was not generous policy. It was an acknowledgement that men flying daylight sorties over occupied Europe were being asked to endure repeated exposure that many would not survive. Official histories of the Army Air Forces and later 8th Air Force studies make the same point in different language. American planners believed heavily armed bomber formations could fight through to the target in daylight. Combat proved the theory was only partly right. Tight formations did increase defensive firepower. They also forced bombers onto steady runs where flak belts could be prepared and timed. Until escort reach improved, the bomber stream remained vulnerable before and after the target. German defenses were organized to exploit exactly that problem. Radar warning and ground control allowed fighter units to be directed toward incoming formations. Anti-aircraft artillery around ports, naval bases, and industrial areas was dense, trained, and increasingly coordinated. The result was not a single barrier but a system. Warning, interception, flak concentration, and follow-up attacks on damaged aircraft falling out of formation. That is why Memphis Belle had such value beyond one crew's survival. It became public proof that 25 missions was a real combat threshold, not a bookkeeping number. The Belle did not show that the system was safe. It showed that under the harsh conditions of early 8th Air Force operations, a crew could survive with the help of skill, leadership, maintenance, formation support, aircraft durability, and luck. German observers drew their own conclusions from raids of this period. They did not see an invulnerable weapon. They saw a persistent American force willing to return again and again in daylight despite losses. American historians later treated that persistence as important in itself. The early bomber campaign exposed serious weaknesses, but it also demonstrated that the United States could sustain pressure, replace aircraft, train crews, and keep expanding operations while learning in combat. Inside that larger story, the meaning of the Belle becomes clearest when the camera moves from doctrine and statistics back to the men who had to live inside them. Captain Robert K. Morgan, the aircraft commander, remained the central public face of Memphis Belle after the tour. He had taken the B-17 through all 25 credited missions, then returned to the United States for the war bond drive. He later flew B-29s in the Pacific and commanded the aircraft named Dauntless Dottie on the first B-29 raid against Tokyo after the Doolittle raid. Morgan survived the war and died in 2004. Captain James A. Verinis, the co-pilot in the right seat, shared the burden of holding formation and managing the aircraft through assembly, bomb run, and recovery. On a B-17, that meant constant instrument scanning, power management, and readiness to take over instantly if the pilot was hit or incapacitated. Verinis survived the war and died in 2003. Captain Vincent B. Evans worked as navigator in the nose, where dead reckoning, charts, timing, and fixes over coastlines and landmarks had to be turned into a route the whole bomber depended on. Technical Sergeant Charles B. Layden, the bombardier, had to take control during the final bomb run and work within the limits imposed by weather, flak, and a steady approach. Their roles were less visible in later publicity than the pilots, but on every mission they were essential to getting the aircraft to the target and off it again. Technical Sergeant Robert J. Hansen, as engineer and top turret gunner, sat close to the mechanical heart of the airplane, monitoring engines and fuel while also fighting from one of the key defensive gun positions. Staff Sergeant Harold P. Locke, the radio operator, maintained communications and manned his own defensive station. The enlisted gunners carried a different strain. They spent long hours exposed to cold, oxygen equipment, vibration, and the knowledge that fighter attack would usually begin at the outer edges of the aircraft. For the Belle's crew as a whole, the documented outcome is the important one. All 10 completed the 25 mission tour and were sent home for war bond work. The men left combat, but the bomber, the mission count, and the use of their survival in public memory were already beginning a second history of their own. After the 17th of May 1943, events moved quickly. Captain Robert K. Morgan and the crew were removed from combat and sent back to the United States. Their return fit a larger need. In mid-1943, the Army Air Forces had to sustain public support for a bombing campaign that was expanding in scale and cost. Memphis Belle and its crew were used on a war bond tour, where a bomber that had actually completed the prescribed tour could be shown to civilians as a frontline aircraft, not a studio prop. The timing mattered. 2 months later, on the 25th of July 1943, the 8th Air Force struck targets in Germany at Hamburg and Warnemünde. On the 17th of August 1943 came the Regensburg and Schweinfurt mission. It proved that American heavy bombers could reach deep objectives, but it also exposed the price of doing it without escort for the full route. Then, on the 14th of October 1943, the second Schweinfurt raid brought losses so severe that deep penetration missions beyond escort range were temporarily suspended. Those later operations sharpened the meaning of the Belle's completed tour. Its record had been finished before the worst crisis of 1943, but inside the same period when daylight bombing doctrine was still being tested against German defenses. The campaign did not become easier after May. It became harder, then had to be reworked. On the German side, the Atlantic bases remained active targets because their reinforced submarine pens could absorb repeated attack. Lorient was bombed again and again. So were Brest and Saint-Nazaire. The immediate operational lesson was blunt. Bomber Command by night and the 8th Air Force by day could damage port facilities, surrounding infrastructure, and submarine support areas, but the heaviest concrete shelters demanded sustained pressure over time. The American answer came through force growth and escort. In late 1943 and early 1944, the arrival of longer-range fighters, especially the North American P-51 Mustang in 8th Air Force service, changed the terms of the battle. During Big Week in February 1944, bomber and fighter forces were used together against the German aircraft industry in a way early 1943 had not allowed. The chain runs straight from crews like Morgan's to that larger shift. Survival first depended on getting to 25, then on changing the system that made 25 so difficult. That leaves the central question in sharper form. How much did one famous survivor actually prove? Memphis Belle is treated as a turning point in public memory less because it altered doctrine by itself than because it fixed one stage of the bomber war in a single recognizable record. Before May 1943, the 25 mission rule was an internal measure of danger. After the Belle's tour, that number had a face, a crew, and an aircraft the public could see. The official United States Army Air Forces history, the Army Air Forces in World War II, describes 1942 and 1943 as the proving period for American daylight bombardment in Europe. That history does not present the early B-17 force as invulnerable. It shows a command learning under fire, struggling with escort limits, weather, navigation, assembly, and mounting opposition. In that framework, the Belle stands as evidence of what was barely possible, not what was typical. Standard accounts of the air war make the same contrast. Lieutenant General Ira C. Eaker's bomber offensive depended on the belief that heavy bomber formations could fight through. The experience of 1943 showed that formations alone were not enough on the deepest routes. Martin Middlebrook's work on the Schweinfurt campaign and the U.S. Air Force's own studies both treat the autumn losses as confirmation that unescorted deep penetration could not be sustained indefinitely. That is where the Belle mattered. It had completed its 25 before Schweinfurt forced the issue in the starkest way. So later audiences looked back on the aircraft not as proof that the original system worked, but as proof of how much a crew had to survive before the system was fixed. German conclusions also matter here. The Luftwaffe and German Air Defense Network did not treat American bombers as unstoppable after early 1943. Their continued concentration on breaking formations, attacking stragglers, and exploiting escort gaps showed they believed the bomber stream could still be hurt badly. The crisis of October 1943 appeared to confirm that judgment. Only when long-range escort imposed continuous pressure on German fighters did the balance begin to move. So the turning point was partly operational, but also historical. Memphis Belle marked the end of the opening phase of the 8th Air Force Bomber War. The period when 25 missions was both the goal and the measure of whether a crew could outlast the system around it. From there, the story passes from strategy and attrition to the men, the airplane, and the way they were remembered. Captain Robert K. Morgan remained tied to Memphis Belle for the rest of his life. After the European tour and bond work, he later flew Boeing B-29 Superfortresses in the Pacific. He survived the war and died in 2004. Captain James A. Verinis also survived the war and died in 2003. Director William Wyler, who filmed the crew in England and in the air, released the Memphis Belle, a story of a flying fortress in 1944. That documentary gave the airplane a permanent place in the visual record of the air war. The aircraft itself had a long and difficult afterlife. After the war, Memphis Belle was presented to the city of Memphis, Tennessee. For years it stood outdoors and deteriorated. It was eventually placed under the care of the National Museum of the United States Air Force. Restoration began in 2005 at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. On the 17th of May 2018, exactly 75 years after the 25th mission, the restored bomber went on public display at the museum. That matters because the airplane is still there as an artifact of the early 8th Air Force campaign. Visitors can see the shape of the B-17F, the nose art, the compact crew positions, and the physical size of the aircraft that carried 10 men through those missions. The museum also preserves the setting in which Memphis Belle now belongs, not as a solitary miracle, but as part of the larger bomber war. Its memory also survives in other forms. The nose art was inspired by Margaret Polk of Memphis, Tennessee. In 1990, the feature film Memphis Belle brought a fictionalized version of a final mission to a new audience, though the wartime documentary remains the primary film record connected to the real crew. At RAF Basingbourn, where the 91st Bomb Group had flown, the association with the Belle remains part of the station's wartime identity. That is the answer to the number from the opening. 25 missions was not a charm, and it was never a guarantee. For most 8th Air Force crews, it was the number they feared because the odds were against them. For Memphis Belle, it became famous for the opposite reason. It showed, in one real bomber and one real crew, how hard that number was to reach at all. If stories like this matter to you, the next one goes even deeper.